60 events around the world to ask why think tanks matter. It's an initiative from the University of Pennsylvania Think Tanks and Civil Societies program. And it coincides with their publication of the Global Go-To Think Tank ranking of 2017. So we're not going to talk about who's where on the ranking, but if you are interested, there'll be a copy of the report on our website, linked to the page for the event. What we are going to do is to ask ourselves, and very certainly the panel are asking themselves, why think tanks matter. The context this year has not changed so much from last year, so why think tanks matter in disruptive periods, and we're currently undergoing, let's say, a number of political and digital disruptions, and indeed in some areas the political and the digital are crossing over to be very disruptive, and the question for us is, where do we fit in? The existential question for think tanks, I think, over a longer period is, who is our audience and how has our audience changed? When we all started, digital, if it existed, meant a website, and our missions were designed for us to be able to inform policymakers and be involved in the policy-making process. Now the public takes a much bigger part in that, and whereas before we were unable to reach the public without going through the prism of the press, which comes with its own problems, now we're able to do it directly. Should we do it directly? How should we do that? What kind of strategy should we employ? But first of all, let me introduce our two panelists. Shada Islam is the Director for Europe and Geopolitics at Friends of Europe. She is our Brussels colleague. In a moment, I'll ask her to introduce herself and also put a context on where she thinks we are in terms of current disruption and how her organization responds to it. And on my left, we have Hilib Wyszynski, who is Executive Director for the Center of Economic Strategy in Ukraine. Bruegel has been part of this annual effort to ask why think tanks matter for a number of years. We're always careful to invite somebody from outside of the Brussels bubble and outside of our own experience, because perhaps think tanks are appreciated in a very different way, in a very different context. I hope that will be enlightening to all of us. But first, we give the floor to Shada.
So thank you very much, Matt. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here and see so many of you old friends here. I'm going to talk about three things. So first of all, these disruptions that Matt has mentioned. How relevant does that make think tanks? And I'll say yes, but I'll tell you why. And my third point is yes, but we have to change. Think tanks can't go on as we have so far. These are troubled times, difficult times, and it behoves us to change. So the disruptions, I mean, we all know, but they're happening on three fronts, I think, which we need to take account of. Of course, the global stage, so Trump and the retreat of the US from the global stage. We've had also, all kinds of China's emergence, Russia's resurgence. So those are things that are happening on the global stage. And if you, as I have just come back from Asia, I was in India, you realize how much those changes, the emergence of China as a very assertive and self-confident player, is, I wouldn't say destabilizing, but changing the balance in that region. So that's something that impacts on us as well. Clearly, within Europe, I mean, the biggest disruption has been Brexit, but also immigration crisis, quote unquote, and, the rise of populism, which is sort of knitted into the immigration debate, unfortunately, I have to say. But there are bigger societal disruptions happening outside as well, and I think we haven't even seen the beginning of what automation, robotization, artificial intelligence are going to do to our societies. Populists are talking about foreigners taking our jobs. It's actually going to be machines and robots that are going to take our jobs, and I don't think we have really thought about it as deeply and strongly as we should have. So the world is changing before our very eyes, and of course, it's a cause for anxiety, unease, and discomfort. But what I see, and that's very much also on my personal level, but also Friends of Europe, I think it's also a moment of excitement, and change is good. I'm deeply, deeply moved by the resistance, #resistance movement in the United States, by how active and how passionate the Remainers are in the Brexit debate as well. And I think these are things that have woken us up. We're all more woke now than ever before, because we were complacent, we'd taken things for granted, the liberal order was moving nicely, you know, everything was going fine, and we had become very, very complacent. We took things for granted. So I think, Matt, this is a wake-up call. It's a wake-up call for our societies, all of us, but also for think tanks. So let me just, my second point about think tanks, I think it makes think tanks even more relevant and important than before, and it makes our task of analyzing and much more challenging. The fact is that we've based all our arguments, all our work on facts and figures, on rational arguments. The pros and cons of something. We've looked into things in a very analytical, we've tried to be very objective, very analytical in the way we've looked at things. It's not working anymore. The people on the other side, if I can say, the illiberals are using techniques and tactics and strategies that we had not even thought of, because we're ethical. We're ethical. We think we should do things in a good way. But so we're unprepared for the fake news, the hybrid threats, and we need, as think tanks, to really hone our communication skills. Facts and figures are very important to back up our arguments, but they need to be communicated with slightly more emotion, more passion, more conviction, if you like. So we need to make that social, emotional connection even when we're using social media. So digital actually needs to be made into a more personal communication, otherwise it doesn't fly. So we're dealing with, as think tanks, you know, Matt, we're dealing with people who have very short attention spans. I mean, nobody can read those big volumes that all of us in the past produced with great, skill and caution, but there they were, and so who has time to read that? We're living in a world which has become also very party political, so, you know, it sort of, whether you like it or not, and you have to be very strong, not to be drawn into this party political trenches, if you like, that are being formed. What is very worrying is also that the discourse, the illiberal discourse, the populist discourse, is gaining more and more traction for many, many reasons, because they have a simple message. So I think for us as well, not only do we have to be passionate and emotional, we actually have to simplify. Now, that's very difficult. I mean, I used to be a journalist before I became a think tanker. It's very difficult to simplify very, very complicated issues that face us. But if I may say so, the other side is doing so. So it, makes it very, very important that we also try and simplify. And, the public is confused. It's confused by all the different messages from all the different social media and mainstream media. TV is still a very powerful tool that they're getting. So we need to ease that confusion. And also, finally, it's a very noisy world. It's a world of insults and offensive discourse, and we need to also make sure that we don't fall into that trap. We need to be more calm and silent when needed, but we need to sort of counter this noisy world. Now, third and final point really is, in order to do this and to meet the challenge, all of us think tanks, I think around the world, Matt, not just in Europe, we need to change drastically. We need to change our composition. Whether we like it or not, we need to bring in, and this is, I think, a very close, something that I believe in, we need to bring in diversity, more diversity into our think tank. It's something that Corina Horst and I have talked about. It's not just about women, though, I have to say. For me, diversity also means bringing all the different strands of the European public, the minorities, the religions, the colors of Europe that make Europe so vibrant into the think tank world. Often, I have to say to you, with some, I have to say dismay, I'm the only brown person, the Muslim person, and the woman in a room. And, it's fine, I can deal with it. But it would be nice to have more succor and more support there. And I think we need to, and why do I say that? It's not just because of the moral issue, Matt. It's also because if you don't have a think tank which is diverse and has all the different strands in it, you're only telling half the story. You're not getting all the right 360 degrees information that you need about the society, the politics of the world we live in. And if you're only telling half the story, you're only building half the narrative of Europe. And at a time when all of us agree, I think, that Europe needs a new sense of life, a new injection of energy and vigor, we really need to bring that total story into it. So I think for the last few years, I would say about 2 or 3 years, what we have been trying at Friends of Europe, and I think it's true for all think tanks, is to change the way we look at it, to become more engaged, to use social media in a more powerful, emotional way. And my final word would be, in this world we live in, we have to dare to be bold. We have to move beyond the groupthink. And we have to think sometimes the unthinkable. Because if we don't, that's what happened with Brexit. So many of us didn't think the unthinkable. That's what happened with Donald Trump. We didn't think about it. We weren't prepared for it. So with that, I'll end my, I think, 10 minutes that you gave me. But it is a very exciting time. I have to say, it's a time for people who think alike to come together and work together. And from that point of view, I'm actually quite upbeat and optimistic at the moment.
Thank you. I will I will also have like 3 chapters in my speech. Like as mentioned, like we are slightly and still outsiders here. I hope that I will be not so old when we will be insiders, like the part of the European Union, as citizens of different countries present here are. So I will start with Ukrainian situation and landscape, especially after Euromaidan, like brought like the sort of second breath for the Ukrainian think tanks. So the new generation of think tanks appeared after Euromaidan, and like if we look on like last year's report of the University of Pennsylvania's think tank project, like they speak about mission and market. So for us, the mission and market was very clear. And I'm the part of this group as our think tank was founded just less than 3 years ago in 2015. So like the first was serving needs for new, better policies. And the second one was closing gaps in the media landscape. Colleagues speak about like competition between think tanks and media to some extent. In Ukraine, media landscape was and still is very weak, like with rather weak traditional media, practically no printed media, quality printed media, and even yellow printed media as well. So sometimes even like closing gaps on the media landscape, covering needs for any policy analysis in the absence of the professional civil service. Like generations of politicians in last 15 years, like before Euromaidan, practically destroyed like some weak but still like existing civil servants of 90s. So when the new people came to the government after 2014, they found that there are no people they could rely on in the government, like no policy analysts working for the government. So in this case, independent groups became like quasi-governmental analysts, not because like government wanted to put them under their control, but because the government just needed any policy analysis and any policy advice of reasonable quality. Like when we look on the same like M's from last year's report, like money. So the money like seen is more or less traditional, like for post-communist countries with traditional international donors like USAID, European Union, Sweden's International Development Agency, but also private donors. And for example, the think tank I'm the head of is in the first 2 years, it was practically like 100% financed by the largest investment bank in Ukraine, like in fact, not investment bank, but like the CEO and majority owner of this investment bank, who is in fact Czech national, but living in Ukraine for 20 years. And like this type of donors became very active in the last 3 years as well. But also like crowdfunding, like the stories, like if anybody of you followed Ukrainian events, especially during the hot phase of war with Russia in 2014, 2015, like you heard about stories of volunteerism when people helped the army, they were crowdfunding, and like the same continued also to support some think tank activities. In the same story of EMS from this University of Pennsylvania story, like we have manpower, like another M. And like in Ukraine, it was a desert in Yanukovych times when like there was practically no chance to influence the government in any reasonable way, and like people left already not so strong think tank industry. Plus, we had no and still have practically no university research tradition. In the Soviet Union, like there was separate, like there were universities and scientific institutions were separate institutions. Universities were just for teaching, and scientific institutions were just for doing science, and which resulted in complete lack of new blood in these old scientific institutions that became completely irrelevant. So here we speak about our relevance, and we still hope to be relevant, but in this case of post-Soviet scientific institutions, they have no chance to be relevant. So the only chance we had to attract manpower was to get inflow from business in 2014, 2015. For example, in our think tank, practically all employees came from private business. Now we have another like challenge as like help in Ukraine became rather fashionable with donors, and they're paying high salaries to analysts and like overheating this market, which means leak of people to technical assistance projects and migration from Ukraine sometime. So like the second part of my story for today is like this new generation of think tanks after Euromaidan, in fact, were born digital and networked. So when we were founded in 2015, like there was no, while I had an experience working for the think tank for 5 years, 20 years ago, but we discussed it with Matt during the lunch, and there was even not a question for me to have or not to have the paper version of our products, because we understood that there will be no reason to have this. On another side, Facebook was a very important communication tool during the Euromaidan revolution, and it is still very important for the new establishment. Like for those of you who do not know this fact, like in fact Euromaidan started from the Facebook post of one of the prominent journalists and civil society activists who now is in the parliament, and especially in first 2 years after Euromaidan, it was a very interesting case. Like I believe that Ukrainian Facebook is very different from Facebooks of all countries present here, because it is very politicized. Like now it is more and more like media platform with fake news, with bot networks, like all this stuff that you could mainly imagine in the Russian context, but like Ukraine is still very close to Russia, and very easy to take bad experience from the neighbor. But in the first, especially in 2014, 2015, even 2016, Facebook was a very, and still continuing to be a very important platform for policy debates. I even made a screenshot for one of presentations when Deputy Minister of Economy, Deputy Head of Presidential Administration, 3 MPs, Deputy CEO of the state-owned gas production company, and multiple independent analysts, as like I am, were discussing the draft law on energy regulator. in a Facebook thread. So, like, not having a round table or some like formal debates, and it was practically in the middle of the night. It was something around 11 p.m. So it is a rather like strange situation, but it meant that we had to work with social media from the very beginning. So, and we had no legacy of old communication tools, like long reports that are important, but we like if you have legacy, like legacy takes your hand and brings you to the past. But if you have no legacy, it is slightly easier. And some expert groups in Ukraine are in fact closer to media than to think tanks. Like, for example, I recommend any of you who are interested looking on Vox Ukraine website, which has a very strong English language version, because it was in fact founded by Ukrainians who went to international universities, and then, like, when the situation in Ukraine became very like very tough, and like the revolution happened, they spent a lot of efforts to help the country. Somebody even returned to Ukraine to work for the government, etc. So this platform is very interesting. Like, my colleague and executive director of the organization that manages it is in fact journalist. Like, he was an editor of the business magazine before. All think tanks that we really had from 90s had to adapt. Like, some did it better. And here I should say a very big thank you to the Swedish government, that has a very strong program of supporting think tanks in Ukraine. And they spent a lot of resources on helping those think tanks who wanted to do it, to adapt to new realities. Like, for example, like one of the strongest think tanks in Ukraine that specialized in public opinion is managed by a lady who is something like 65 years old, but still it has a very strong social media presence and very strong communications, because they use this opportunity, and they are continuing to be very relevant while maintaining data from the last 25 years. But still, like, there are very traditional techniques of getting heard, especially like in this new environment when like policy advice is needed. So still direct communication and survey needs of stakeholders. Sometimes I believe that it is even like the situation is better, especially with those people who are interested in pushing for reforms, even for like their cynical political reasons. It is even easier than in a well-established democracies. Like, for example, when I was flying to Brussels, I received email that I am invited to the Prime Minister for the meeting tomorrow. Like, I don't know, I still do not know what I will discuss with him, but and what will be the circle of people. But it is really usual for Ukrainian think tank people to go to meetings to Prime Minister, sometimes to the President. So it is like these old tools, I believe they will be still very relevant. Like, we are still people, and we still like and trust in personal communications. What is really the biggest challenge is communication to the general public. I believe that we need to do this communication to the general public. Like, our founders believe in it. Like, one of our co-founders is Ivan Miklos, former Slovakian Vice Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. He started from the very beginning advising us to have this communication to the general public, to be in fact like not a think tank. He called it policy action tank. And it requires skills, and like skills of speaking on TV talk shows, sometimes discussing with a very well-trained populace. But also it requires very good understanding of the audiences. Like, in fact, like very good media analysis. Like, in Ukraine, it is sometimes complicated because like our key TV channels are controlled by oligarchs. Like, as I told you previously, like no printed media, practically no printed media. And like many organizations still have no resources for it, like because of usual reasons for think tanks worldwide, like donor project funding, like traditional communication tools that are liked by donors, like conferences, etc. But there are very interesting cases that are very successful. Like one I want to mention is Anti-Corruption Action Center, which is something in between like advocacy group and a think tank. Like its head is so influential in Ukraine. Like for example, he has 80,000 followers on Facebook. Like this group / think tank has separate Twitter accounts in Ukrainian and in English for like international partners. Like he personally, Vitaly Shabunin, he's so important that like in fact government now is like authorities, I could say, not like cabinet of ministers, are organizing campaign against him, like trying to harass him, to organize, to fabricate criminal charges against him. So like some small scale of like Navalny case in Ukraine, but he's not a politician. Like he's a civil activist. So they have beautifully crafted posts on Facebook. They have yeah. But they still have direct liaison with international partners like an IMF. And like also we have a very strong coalition of the NGOs called Reanimation Package of Reforms that organizes 80 NGOs, mostly think tanks, which was founded in 2014, which is organized in expert groups, and in fact it is like the sort of mouthpiece of peer-reviewed policy ideas. So like finally, like so we are right, like we found ourselves right in the midst of global challenges. So in 2016 we understand that we need like a new sense of purpose with less direct influence on the government, because like it became less reformist, but and more technical assistance received by the government for policy analysis. So we were focusing on communication to the general public, on fighting populism, and on making pressure on the government. So how to do this? Like final points. So the first is segmentation of the audience. I worked in market research for 12 years, so I could speak about it in detail. I will not do it now, but like generally. So we understand that there are decision makers, we understand that there are opinion leaders and media, and we understand that there is general public with different groups of general public. And like so we need, second point, to do a very good media planning. We have owned media, which is social media, that we do have, including personal pages of our key experts, which is very important due to this constantly changing algorithms of Facebook, for example, that prefers personally produced content to pages, and which means that like if you are developing your personal Facebook pages, especially in those countries where Facebook is very important in policy debate, like you need to develop like personal Facebook pages for your key experts. Website, yes. Newsletters, still very important, and like still working rather well in Ukraine. Like very interesting to hear about experience of the colleagues. Like even messengers, like in Ukraine, I don't know, is it fashionable in other countries here as well, but like, for example, Telegram is used by many expert groups to promote the content, like as a sort of like for those of you who remember RSS feed, like it is close to RSS feed sometimes, to Twitter, like just communication messages. So owned media, then acquired media, like blogs, columns, comments on TV and in other media, but also like maybe paid media, like which is a question for us, like should we sponsor our content on Facebook, like how it will be considered by our audience. So then the third, how to understand value for money, like how to understand the size of the audience, the quality of the audience, like where influencers are to the larger extent, if we want to have our opinion heard by the general public via influencers, like people who are opinion leaders, plus editorial policies, where editorial policies are giving us a higher chance to promote our ideas. And the final force, so like in fact we need a media mix like some FMCG companies have. So which means that we need a lot of analysis. We need to understand needs and channels that are the most easy to use by our customers. And in fact, like, we need to understand our audience as a mix of very small groups. Each of these groups has its own needs and channels, and it is not so straightforward, so there is no silver bullet, unfortunately. Thank you.
Thank you. No silver bullet. Okay, I want to expand a little bit on what you've both said before we move to questions from the audience, and thank you for all of you who submitted questions beforehand. I mean, if you have some feedback on how that goes, that's an experiment for us. And hopefully we'll also take some questions from Twitter. So, Shada, you talked about emotion, passion, and conviction. It's almost as if you want think tank experts to develop personalities. How does that interact with our old model of, you know, trust me, I'm a doctor of economics? You know, how does that work? And will our messages inside the research be negated if they're full of emotion, passion, and conviction? So does emotion, passion, and conviction come in the communication, or should it also be part of how we do our research now?
Yeah, so I think we have to develop, I think every think tank, whether we acknowledge it or not, does have a personality. I mean, when each of us here in Brussels, for instance, are known for something that we're really good at. And I think that is the personality of our think tank. And what we produce, in a sense, I used to be a journalist, and I think a lot of the work I'm doing now is very similar to what I did as a columnist. Mm-hmm. I mean, you talked about the media here, and I think, you know, it's right to engage with the media, but in many ways, I confess, as a former journalist, today's media is, I think, abdicating some of its responsibility in terms of asking the right questions. You see it on the BBC all the time, you know, when certain people are interviewed. The questions just aren't the ones that we would like to hear put to these people, especially the populists, the Farages and Trumps of this world. Those questions aren't being put by journalists at the moment. I feel very, very bad about that. And I think it's part of our job now as think tankers to take up our, I was going to say take up our pens, to bring out our iPads, etc., and in a sense do the work that good journalists should be doing. I see very much that, asking the right questions, going to the right people, asking embarrassing questions. I think all of this will only matter, and seriously, is if we've done the research. So you can't go against that. I mean, you need to have the well-done research, the facts and the figures. But putting them out, like we did in the past, saying, you know, this is this and this will convince other people, you saw that. There are alternative facts out there. I mean, you know, those don't matter. We have to keep our ethics, very much so. But I think it's the communication style that needs to change a little bit. Whether it's on social media, television, and Hilip said, you know, engaging with the media, or whether it's just in the things we write ourselves, we have to engage more. Otherwise, we're going to lose the battle, and I think, sadly, we already are losing the battle a little bit. So this is something that I think all of the think tanks, I mean, academics really can't do it. This is why we're not really academics, are we? Academics can't abandon their work, their style, but we are supposed to be, aren't we, midway between academia and journalism. And I think we need to occupy that space in a more sort of self-confident and, if I may use the word, colourful way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, colourful. Okay, that's also a challenge. Hilip, you just described there how you got invited by the Prime Minister to go and see, presumably him, tomorrow. That kind of access and those kind of invitations are something that Shada and I would die for, or rather kill for. And yet your focus was very much also on a segmented audience. I mean, which is more important in the Ukrainian context, or are they, you know, is it the fact that because there's so little expertise or professionalism inside government that you have this access to government, or is the work that you do with your segmented audience more important or more effective?
I believe that our government is, to the large extent, it is very similar to us in like being born digital. Like this, after like post-Euromaidan governments, they understand like the same things, and their communication people understand the same things we understand, which means that like sometimes they use you as like this sort of influencer, like the sort of friend, because in a very like dispersed and unclear political landscape in Ukraine, like as many stakeholders you involve in like supporting you, as successful like you will be. And it means that like when Prime Minister invites us, it is to one extent like listening to our ideas, but on another extent, it is just like building relationship and building his political support. And certainly, like, unfortunately, I could say, it is mostly with people who are more or less similar in terms of at least ethical standards. Like I could discuss with our Prime Minister, like should land market be open more fast or more slow? Like he will prefer slower because it is more popular with general public. But like still we have more or less the same ethical platform and like general like vision of economic policies. We see that it will. Like it is absolutely needed to work with general public, because otherwise like our ideas will be useless for even those politicians with whom we do have good relationship, because they will, as they are weak, like in this like post-Euromaidan period, like. And currently governments are weak. I believe that in most of countries in the European Union, like governments are rather weak, I could say. And everybody needs support of as much stakeholders as possible. And everybody are looking on a daily basis on opinion polls, and those who are smarter are looking on not just opinion polls on which they could see like the level of political support, but like they are looking on support of different policies. Like the new tool we are currently promoting, like we did like the first phase with the help of the Czech government funding last year, was a very detailed opinion survey on 5 reforms that were in the pipeline for the government for the autumn of last year. And it was really very interesting. I don't know to which extent is it usual for think tanks in Western Europe to work this way. Because in many cases, like these debates of like popular policies against unpopular policies are in fact debates about names, name of like labor reform or like migration reform or some other reform. But like what we saw in Ukraine was that, like, for example, people could be against the name of, for example, healthcare reform. But like if you speak about the components of this reform, people are for these components. And it was like, so attitude to the reform generally is a political question, but attitude to reform and attitude to policy itself is a very normal personal question, like as everybody have its own experience with healthcare system and could answer, like, will it be better or worse for them if something changes here. So I believe that it could be rather important for think tanks to look more on public opinion and to like try to build the bridge between policy analysis and opinion research.
Apply to the work of Friends of Europe in your own work. Do you now feel that you need to build some kind of momentum with the general public to support the policy agenda that you put forward?
Absolutely. So I don't know how many of you know Debating Europe, which is a very, very active arm of Friends of Europe. So Debating Europe is an online chat platform, and it's for, if I may use the word, ordinary citizens. It's for citizens, students, and they engage with policymakers. So we, for instance, at the moment, we have an ongoing debate with the European Ombudsman, Emily O'Reilly, whereby citizens put in their questions and then Emily responds to them online. So we've really made, this has been going on now for about 5 years, Debating Europe, and that's a very, very close engagement with citizens. Also, of course, you know, we are trying very hard to be, so when we have our conferences, just like you do, Matt, we also we use our live tweets, we engage as much as we can with the general public, because in this period of European revival, if I could say so, or efforts at European revival, we really need to have a wider discourse. And also, just like you and Lib here, you know, when we can, we, as members of the think tank, we go out and speak to students, you know, we speak to anyone who wants to engage with us. We do go out of our offices, and that's part of our job, to be on TV, to talk to everyone, to engage. And I think, you know, you said, I love it, you said, trust me, I'm a doctor, trust me, I'm a think tanker. I think, you know, to get that trust at a period where there's such mistrust or distrust of anyone in power is a key challenge. And I think that is what we have to say. My final point, if I could just say, you know, I was reading somewhere and I thought really, really spoke to me, if I may say. It said numbers are important, but numbers don't have emotion. Stories, it's how you convert those numbers into stories, into tales of narratives. That's what really counts. And I think, you know, I wasn't born in Europe, but for me, the European story is such a fantastic story. It really, really resonates deep inside. And I think, you know, if we could have stories about Europe at this very important time, we would be able to communicate in a stronger fashion with those who are absolutely disaffected or just, you know, bored. Don't make it tedious, you know. And sometimes you really think, you know, that's what Trump has done. He's made things more less tedious, less boring, in a way that has woken us up, you know. So I think, you know, if we can bring that emotional connection into things we do, and we all do it, I think it's just very, very essential now. It's a compelling necessity now.
Okay, so let's engage in some of that engagement with you. Is Christine Priol here? Yes, Christine. So we have been addressing some of your questions. Having listened to that, do you want to reframe your question? And can you answer your own question? You know, what is it that makes us authoritative, and are we communicating well enough? There's a microphone there. We've covered it. Okay, all right. Shahada talked about ethics, and obviously these are very important in your space. We have a question from Marta. Marta, I can't say your last name. Are you in the audience?
Yes,
yeah.
I'm here. It's,
okay.
But I totally understand your trouble. Well, thank you, first of all, for giving me the opportunity to speak. For me, when I think about the disruptions, I think very strongly about the changes, the social changes and how knowledge is used and how it's interpreted, spread, etc. And well, my observation is that what we now deal with are very polarized communities of knowledge and communities of trusted knowledge that comes from certain sources. And for me, in that puzzle, facts can really become weapons. And because we have such diversity of facts, diversity of experts, different uncertainties and incoherences, we basically can weaponize any group with some version of a truth, not necessarily black and white, you're right, I'm wrong, etc. And in that, it seems to me that in that landscape, it would make sense for think tanks to be the ones, as you sort of mentioned when it came to the role of sort of media-like role of think tanks, that think tanks could be spaces which bring various voices together, which create some space for debate, which is no longer the tribal debate of a given community. But then my question is, what about partiality and impartiality when it comes to think tanks? Obviously, we have quite obvious examples when we have party think tanks. You know what their lines are. But what about other think tanks which also have some kind of an agenda? It's not necessarily a question that one is more right than the other, and how do we deal with that issue? Thank you.
So if I can, the question is basically about polarization. Should think tanks be a space where, and should we have a responsibility to bring parties together? How do we engage a debate that isn't tribal? And really fantastic question. I don't know is the answer, but maybe these two do. And then impartiality. I mean, this is that's a very interesting situation to be. So impartiality, are you impartial? Because I think that in your communications, would you call yourself impartial? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we even have the specific clause in our statutes that we are not favoring any political party or political leader.
Right. But well, not favouring one political party or political leader is one thing, but but not necessarily being impartial. But I mean, perhaps let me rephrase the question. Is it difficult for you to engage in debates that aren't polarized?
Like in Ukraine, it is a very high polarization. It is slightly different between, slightly different from like what is going on in like Western Europe or United States. But it is polarization. I looked on my smartphone to correctly translate it into English. In Ukraine, there are like hashtags Zrada and Перемога, where Zrada is treason and Перемога is victory. So like, and this is like this post-Euromaidan thing that like all policies, decisions, events are classified into either treason or victory. And So I believe that this polarization is really a global trend. Like in each country, it has its own way of the way how it looks like. But I believe that it is a unique place for us to be, in fact, in between like this treason and victory, and I believe that also it is like creating respect to us. As people, emotionally, it is very easy to stick to either treason, especially to treason. To victory, it is not so easy to stick, usually, and but like still, it is much like both positions are easier than to be somewhere in between. And but on another side, like people understand that everything in the life could not be classified into these two categories. So when they hear a thoughtful voice of people who say that, like, this is closer to treason, but this is closer to victory, and like this guy, for example, the same prime minister, like sometimes doing things that are closer to this, and sometimes doing things that are closer to that, but which it doesn't mean that he is completely wrong or completely right. And in this policy, like you have 80% of good things and 20% of not so good things. Let's hope it will be slightly changed in the nearest future. So I believe that like in terms of this polarization, there is a unique space for us that we should use. In terms of impartiality, like it could be more complicated. Like for example, I was raised in the tradition as an economist in the tradition of and plus as a person in the tradition of like democracy movements of end of ages and like this so-called Washington consensus of the same period. And it is not very easy for me to listen about new industrialist policies, more control over people and giving them less freedom because it will be better for them. So I understand that sometimes I'm deaf in when listening to these arguments, but I don't know how to deal with it.
Shada, I was interpreting your opening remarks as that there is a battle, a two-sided fight, liberal versus illiberal, in which you've kind of captured that polarization. Do you want to expand? I mean, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I don't like binary sort of choices, you know, you're with us or outside us, or you're with us or against us, you know, that kind of thing. I don't like it. I think there is always a middle ground to be found. And I think one of the things that we do have to try, despite taking a passionate position, which is pro-liberal, pro-tolerance, pro-open societies, do try and engage with people who disagree. The problem we have is many of the people who disagree don't want to engage with us. And what we have decided is we want to engage with you, but we will question you. So gateholders or whoever, if you're going to come to a Friends of Europe event, first of all, we don't want to engage with racists, but okay, let's say that non-racist illiberals, if such a thing is there. If you come, you must be ready to answer questions. We are not going to give you a platform for you to spread your hate and say, you will have to take questions. We say that to practically, I think, everyone, except perhaps, you know, I don't know, but basically anyone who comes has to engage. The second thing is that, so they don't want to, and I think that shows their feet of clay, because, I mean, if you have such strong opinions, you should be able to then defend them in an argument, which is why they love television, because many of the television journalists just don't do their job. I come back to that. About the partiality, impartiality, I think just like Bruegel and SEPS and EPC and others here in Brussels, we are impartial politically, so we're obviously non-partisan, makes us quite different from American think tanks, also makes us more difficult and more challenging to find the right sort of financing for us, because we don't take sides in a political debate, but we do take sides, all of us, I think, for Europe. In all its different facets, you know. So I think that is something that we always say. We are pro-European. We're not necessarily close to the EU institutions. We're all very critical of the EU institutions when we need to be, but we engage with them. And I think more and more, they engage with us as well. And I think this is something that perhaps we should highlight about Brussels, is that there is more of a two-way street discussion going on between think tanks and policymakers here. So I think, you know, I do agree with you, and I think that was a fantastic sort of tribal culture that we're developing. But we're trying to break out of it. But it takes two, as everyone here in Brussels keeps saying, it takes two to tango, right? You do tango, don't you?
I do.
Yeah.
Every morning. So I'm very happy to hear actually that you know, this moving on from the old question in the old days, and I'm sure Shada will agree with me, it was all about independence. Are you independent as a think tank? And it was a nonsense. Independent of what? And I'm glad that we're moving on to a more sophisticated debate about that, which is about impartiality, impartiality with passion. Shada, because recognizing that, that none of us are independent, but the question isn't whether you're totally independent, but the question is, are you independent enough to carry out your mission? Are you independent enough to bring a valuable contribution to the policy-making community? Are you independent enough to occupy a legitimate part of what is essentially a democratic process? I think those are much more interesting. And now this partiality and impartiality, very sophisticated. I would argue that we try to be impartial, but of course the facts, the evidence are going to lead you to a partial opinion. I think how you communicate that, though, is the key. Thank you for that. So let's move on to a related topic. Thomas Schneider, is he here? No? Okay, so Thomas was basically going to ask a question about how do we insert facts? How do we use facts in what is essentially going to be a very passionate debate, where I guess where I'm going with this is, do we have a responsibility as institutions whose bread and butter is evidence and facts, and I prefer the word evidence to facts because facts change, believe it or not. And do we have a responsibility to counter false evidence, fake news? Is there a responsibility for us, and why would it be our responsibility as organizations that were initially set up to be an aid to policymakers? Perhaps you'd like to take the first.
It is not a specialty of our think tank, but we have our neighbors in the same building. This platform I showed previously, Vox Ukraine, they have a special project, Vox Check, where they have a dedicated team of fact checkers, and it is, I believe, the new breed of organizations throughout the world, and it's good that we have one of these organizations in Ukraine, and they are doing it full time, and they are becoming rather, I could say, influential in making pressure on politicians, as they are, as I told you, the organization is headed by the journalist. The head of this project is former journalist as well of this fact-checking project, and which means that they know media landscape very well. And if they say that, for example, the head of this political party in some given period or on some specific issue spoke 80% of lies, and this political leader spoke only 20% of lies, it is really have an impact. And what I heard from them is that those politicians are already trying to reach them and to have some influence on their work, to discuss their findings, etc. And it's really very important if it is organized well in terms of media communications.
So, do we have a responsibility in the Brussels bubble to be countering fake news?
Well, absolutely. I think, there's plenty of evidence there to counter. Let's just take this very emotional and toxic debate on immigration and Islam, Islamophobia, whatever you want to call it. There are so many facts available that counter this diatribes and this bashing that we get. The fact is, those facts are hidden in reports, whether it's the Fundamental Rights Agency, whether it's the UNHCR, whether it's Amnesty, those reports, those facts and figures that counter the fake news, the alternative facts and lies that are out there are there. So it is, and we do our own research as well, but what I'm saying is those facts are there, but they're really hidden jewels in massive reports. And I think one of the things that we, as I said, build a story, a counter-narrative, if you like, though I prefer to call it a more positively a proactive narrative, but using the evidence and the facts that are there, but that somehow our politicians, which are enamored of the far-right narrative because they think it brings them votes, but Macron, I think, has proven that it doesn't always do that. They don't use it. So I think that's something that I think, but evidence in its own needs to come with a frame around it, a context around it. The other thing I'll just say to you is also, Matt, I think very important for think tanks, because the journalists once again aren't doing it. There's a sort of tendency everywhere to go to the extremists. When something happens, you polarize. You talk to the right and the extreme left, or what I'm saying. And you forget that there are people in the middle, or that there are stories out there of interesting men and women who have made it with a narrative of tolerance and openness and inclusiveness, and we don't talk to them. And I think it's our duty frankly, to our societies to bring out those people. I'm just giving you an example, right? Jesse Klaver in the Netherlands, Green Links, during the awful election campaign when everything was nasty, 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 that man had a story that was a very, very inclusive story, a fantastic story. Did anyone in the Anglo-Saxon, the English-speaking globalist press ever interview him? Only Amanpour did it after he made a breakthrough in the Green Links. Same thing happened with Marine Le Pen, excuse me, was getting much more airtime than Emmanuel Macron was getting in the run-up to the election. So, those people, there are stories out there. There are politicians out there in Germany at the moment, interesting young men and women. We don't bring them up into the limelight, into the spotlight. I think that's part of our job, is to actually bring the success stories, the passionate people, the people who are making a difference onto our stage. We have a valuable asset there, in giving them more space than they have.
One of the debates that we're having here, that was happening in India this morning, we're saying that there's a role for think tanks to play backup to advocacy organizations. I mean, is that what you're saying, when we need to highlight the stories that the press doesn't take up, or promote the facts that the gems that are lost in reports? I
don't like to talk about think tanks as being advocacy groups, because advocacy for me is a narrow tunnel. It's about the environment, it's about climate change, it's about human rights. It's silos, and that's what advocacy groups are good at, and that's what they should be doing. I think we have a broader agenda, and we have a more amorphous agenda, a more diffused agenda. If I say we're pro-European, we're not just working on issues to do with green energy, we're also talking about development policy, just like you are, different things. So I don't like being compared to an advocacy group. I think ours is a broader, more strategic, if you like, agenda. Then they're very valuable, but more focused approach.
And in your work, do you work with advocacy groups?
Yeah, maybe it is. There are still differences between developed and developing countries in this context, because for me, this Indian way is easier to understand. I mentioned, this anti-corruption organization that is very strong, which is closer to advocacy groups than to the think tank, in fact. And currently we share the common vision with this. In fact, it is the strongest of the groups, but it is a really very strong anti-corruption movement in Ukraine, consisting of different NGOs. And currently we have number one policy decision to be made is building the final block of anti-corruption vertical, which currently is National Anti-Corruption Bureau, Special Prosecutor, and finally we need to build anti-corruption court. And after this, this post-Soviet system of impunity will really have a chance to be destroyed. But when it is still in place, it prevents economic growth, because it could result in losing property rights. Because of corruption, it could result in racketeering, it could result in raider attacks. So we understand, and people in the government also understand that without changing this system that could that is in fact prevention investment, we could not have much faster economic growth, and we could not get higher, better well-being for Ukrainians. While it is not an economic policy, it is in fact the policy related to judiciary and to the rule of law. And in this case, it means that really we are the sort of the singing in the background to those people who are who are promoting, who are advocating these anti-corruption actions, like building this final stone in this anti-corruption vertical. And for example, one of the last opinion pieces I wrote was what will be the consequences of not creating this anti-corruption court, that is currently the key conditionality in the IMF program for Ukraine. What will be the consequences for the financial situation, for Ukrainian national currency, for inflation, and what will be the price that we will pay in terms of, for example, additional expenses on servicing the public debt of Ukraine. So in Ukraine it works. I don't know, like especially like exact context of like Indian cooperation between think tanks and advocacy groups, but in Ukraine it works sometimes in this way as well.
We've had some response on Twitter to what we're talking about. I'm very happy to say. So the question is, besides polarization, isn't there a risk of atomization amongst think tanks, becoming too granular, too siloed? I mean,
I don't see that happening here in Brussels.
right.
It may be the case in many countries outside where they are more focused on specific topics, etc. And I think India is a case where people are working on urbanization, there's specialized think tanks on clean energy, urbanization, things like that. But here in Brussels, I don't think that is very much the case. That tends to be done by not think tanks, but organizations together. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning also is that think tanks, we have networks, right?
Yes.
I mean, it's very interesting, actually. We work, as you do, with think tanks in India, in China, in Japan, in Russia, and that is a community where, you were talking about tribal and polarization, etc. And sometimes track two, which is what it's called, really, track two discussions, take the place of when say, just to give you an example from when I was born, India and Pakistan are actually at loggerheads, not talking to each other, almost on the point of war, always a heartbeat away from war. The think tank communities actually talk to each other all the time and make headway. China and Taiwan, think tanks are working together, Korea and China, Japan. And I think this is it's often misunderestimated, as our American friends would say, but it's a very valuable part of our think tank communities that we actually have these exchange programs that I think foster understanding, a lot of disagreements, a lot of arguments, but we talk to each other and keeps communities close together. I think academics do that too, but I think this is more vivacious, our dialogues, and you know what I'm talking about. Yeah. I mean, in all facets, we've had one here as well.
Yeah. You and I have even been on a panel where we've organized something together.
Exactly.
Hilib, I'm sorry, but not sorry to ask. And the question, do you talk to Russian think tanks?
We do not talk to Russian think tanks. I believe on this stage it is like the situation is too hot. And like I have a lot of conversation with Ukrainian think tanks.
Wait, no. The way the chairing goes is I will call on you in a second, okay? You get to reply when he's finished.
Okay, I could speak only on
your experience. Sure.
On the experience of our think tanks, those I speak most often. But
do you engage in any track 2 activities?
With the Russian?
With anybody. With anybody.
With anybody, like I wanted to comment on it. I shortly mentioned it in my speech. Like the coalitions that we have with the strange name of reanimation package of reforms, as it was like after Euromaidan, and like, in fact for reanimation purposes, is in fact very good example. And like people are saying that it is one of unique examples in the world of liberal pro-European coalition of NGOs and think tanks, and like currently it is funded by the European Commission, like by a grant, and it will be funded by Swedish government, I believe, starting from this year, and the whole idea is that, like, in fact, it is very interesting for me to get knowledge from for issues that I'm not a specialist on, but that are just like that are very close to our specialty, like judiciary, like for example, law enforcement agencies, general human rights. So because it helps to build a much wider picture and to understand what is influencing the situation. And in most of the countries, like these things, like these liberal policies, they go together. Like, for example, our closest neighbor in the West, Poland, like they started from like liberal things in economy, like pressing, like putting pressure on foreign investment in some areas. Then they continued in the judiciary system before they did something in other areas of democratic institutions. So, and it means that like we need to build coalitions that are not so impartial.
Although I think there's a difference between building coalitions and track 2. Yeah. Yes, please. Now you get to say, hopefully, so tell us who you are and where you're from.
I'm absolutely happy. I'm from Russia. My name is Andrei Bystritsky. I'm the chairman of...
you asked a question earlier.
Yes, I said a question. Probably the main problem is just... The main problem is that we have too many think tanks. Because, seriously, we have a lot of conversation between Russian and Ukrainian think tanks, and I absolutely agree that it's maybe 100 think tanks in Ukraine, maybe 200 in Russia. Totally through the world, probably thousands, maybe 10,000. But the population of think tankers, is equal probably to population of Belgium. No, seriously.
Population of Belgium.
A lot of scientists, millions of people. I think in China 100,000, approximately.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the biggest thing like in Xinhua, for instance. Maybe too many think tanks, too many ideas, too many participations, too many events. Davos, World Economic Forum, this small meeting, big meeting in Munich, a lot of meetings. That's true. A lot of people. It's a crowd, tribes of politologists, sociologists, think tankers, move through the world, the same words, the same discussions. It's a crazy situation. It seems to me today think tanks remind me a small bird, canary. But in the culture there are two main roles of canary. There's a miner's canary and criminal canary. Criminal canary, as usual, spend time in prison and help administration to keep control. The miner's canary helps miners and time to time save it. But historically, the role of think tanks was more important. For instance, Cicero in ancient Rome was executed by Caesar because he was a think tanker. He tried to help his fatherland to save it. Marsilio Ficino in 15th century created a fantastic academy for creation bold ideas. In 100 ago, Chatham House became very important position. Now, we are waiting for very miserable life for think tanks. My question is very simple. First of all, thank you very much for your speeches. It's very simple. What is the first real step? Of course, a lot of discussions about new hierarchy of media and so on and so on. It's a common sense. What should we do? What is the first practical step? Not discussion about our role in the process. Sorry, excuse me. Thank you.
Okay, so let me try and read back the question so that we can all understand it. I love the idea that we might be canaries, and let's remember that the poor canaries in the mines had to die to serve the miners. So what's the real step? I mean, maybe can I paraphrase your question in that many think tanks in Russia and Ukraine, a lot of talking, no action. Is it all, or as we used to say in England, all mouth, no trousers? Yeah, okay. So that's a hard question, so I'm going to ask our panelists first. Do we talk too much and achieve too little, Shada?
We do talk,
Yeah.
but we also think. No, I think. I mean, I take what you've said, and there is a truth to it that people do go to conferences, whether it's Davos or Munich or Resina or Wow. You know, we go there, and we're actually heartened and reassured to see other people who more or less, you know, agree with us or disagree with us. But it's all very polite, very courteous, and I think, you know, that is a fair assessment. It's not a criticism because, you know, as someone said, Giorgio is better than war. So, I mean, if we are talking, we're not shooting at each other, which I think in today's world is important. But I think you underestimate what thinkers can do. I mean, through history, and you've pointed out to some thinkers yourself, there is a need for people who look beyond today's knotted problems to a future, who, when they see a problem, also see a solution. And who, I think, as I said, can think the unthinkable, to think ahead, and look beyond what looks like intractable. And that, I think, in an ideal world is what think tanks do. But maybe lead by inspiration. I mean, all kinds of poetic things can happen. We just have to do our job, which is to think ahead, to think I would say constructively in a world which is polarized and atomized and all that. And that is not, I would say, a minimal task in today's world. Huh? I mean, when Trump or Viktor Orban or people lash out with untruths and lies, and there has to be a reaction. I think we are part, if I may say so, part of the reaction, #resistance.
Hilib, you talked about being part of the second generation of think tanks in a post-1989 world, fully formed digitally when you were born, which is great. Are the second generation think tanks in Ukraine more relevant than the first generation? How is competition affecting you? I mean, are there too many think tanks?
I believe that we are more relevant in terms of working with general public and with opinion leaders. However, I think that, like, answering the question, like, the first thing we should do is to better understand needs of our clients. And it means that, like, as everything changed so rapidly in terms of using different communication channels, in terms of using information in different formats, in terms of shortening attention spans of most people, not only in the government, where it was also always very short because they are very busy, but among the general public as well. We need to understand what are the needs, especially of those people we are reaching directly, like, for example, policymakers, opinion leaders, media people. Ask them what should be formats we are giving our research to them, and we understand that there should be many different formats, a lot of repackaging of the same ideas for different clients. So it is one thing. The second thing is really thinking a lot of media planning and how to deliver ideas not just in a way of these conferences, discussions, these traditional formats, but how to do it directly. Like, for example, of my limited knowledge of, like, Russian media landscape now, and which is influencing Ukrainian media landscape as well, is a new culture of video blogging, where, like, key video bloggers have audiences of millions of people, and in many cases they are very political. So it is like the new format we need to look on. Plus, the old thing that is still very relevant and which could make our work much more useful, just confront the issues, and I believe that it is more relevant to developing countries where the quality of policy analysis in the government is lower. Just addressing daily issues in the government, not really daily, I could say like months, or those type of challenges they have, those questions they have and that they need to address by policy decisions, and sometimes giving them very detailed analysis that could be very easily transformed into specific policy decision, especially if we had very good example with some of our studies that were in between areas in the government. Like, for example, the compensation schemes for civil servants. Like, what should be the better compensation scheme? Because, for example, in Ukraine, it is somewhere in between Ministry of Finance, the agency responsible for civil service, Ministry of Social Policy, and it resulted in 3 years of endless talks about the problems of the compensation system for the civil servants, but no decision because there was no responsible agencies that could prepare at least any analysis. So we did it, and it was very, we got a very unusual level of respect to our findings from mid-level bureaucrats in these ministries, because they understood that those people who are in some strange think tanks sometimes could do a very good analysis they were not able to do themselves.
Okay, we are losing our physical audience, and so one final point. There were in a conversation this morning in Berlin, same event. One of the things they discussed was, should think tanks create more controversy? I'm delighted to be able to tweet about a conversation about think tanks from Saudi Arabia, where they were advocating a theatrical and practical approach. So controversy, theatre, the tools of the entertainment industry, are they going to play a part in our future? Let's start with you first, and I'm going to give the last word to Shada.
I'm sure that yes, that we need to have more trainings in good public speaking, in storytelling, like we are living in the changing world when it is very hard to take the person from his or her smartphone, from the endless news feed on Facebook or on Instagram or in social media, and take by hand and say something that could distract the person from those already distraction things. So we need to do it, and I believe that it will be for good, because it will develop us as people, as experts, as personalities.
Okay, Shada?
Yeah,
Theatre, controversy?
Absolutely. We're already doing it. We're doing it. I mean, 10 years ago, Matt, we would have been sitting behind a desk,
Yep,
or whatever, a panel, and you would have said to me, you would have introduced me and said, 10 minutes, say whatever you want to say, and there would hardly have been any real connection. So I think, this kind of format, this is evolving even further, the Twitter, you have to, I mean, that's what I mean when I say stories. It's actually, yeah, theatre is a good word too. Because if you can't grab somebody's attention and keep them engaged and interested in what you're saying, you've lost the plot. Literally, you've lost that person. And I think we webinars that are being held, and as climate change arguments become more forceful, people will probably, and visa restrictions become more powerful, we'll also probably be doing much more on FaceTime and Skype than we do now. And I think that's why we always turn to interesting people, it's not always the politician. We turn to the stars. Angelina Jolie, I'm going to show you, she was sitting here. Not everyone, would have looked at the watch and said they're leaving. So, those kinds of...
She will be here tomorrow.
Great.
Well, not here at Bruegel. She's at NATO.
No,
tomorrow.
no. I was thinking, oh my God, what a coup. Yeah, no, I know. That's why actually I read about Angelina Jolie this morning on Ryan Heath, and that's why I mentioned her specifically.
Yeah.
And I think now is the time to become even more controversial, because we have this big European Parliament elections coming up. The Commission is going to change. There'll be new leadership, hopefully real leadership across the EU institutions, changes. And I think that's the time when we can, if we want to really be different, this is when we should start putting up our stalls and making our ideas known. Do we still want party political, the candidates from parties, I can't say it in German, or do we want merit and quality and, real credentials to count this time around? Do we want more women? Do we want more diversity? What kind of parliament should there be? Do we want a convention of people, public consultations? I mean, these are such important issues, and we have to make them part of our story and make them more interesting so people become engaged. Otherwise, we're going to have another European Parliament election where 30% turnout, if we're lucky. We can't afford that. We literally, sorry to say, can't afford that. The stakes are much too high.
Thank you both. It's been a very interesting conversation.
Yes.
I've learned a lot. I personally commit to being more theatrical in the future, if that's possible. Please continue the conversation on Twitter. It's a global conversation, and these events will be continuing to run over the 24 hours of the 30th of January. And I believe the big one in Washington, D.C. will be live streamed sometime this afternoon. Have a look on our website for details. The hashtag is #ThinkTanksMatter. Thank you, Clib. Thank you, Shada. And thank you to you.